Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are digging deep into the Wheel of Time with some lore on the breaking of the world. As always, like and subscribe for more Wheel of Time content, and if you'd like to help support the channel, check out Road to Tarvalon on Patreon and YouTube memberships. So let's get into it. The timeline of events in the Wheel of Time can be broken into a few major time frames. The first is called the First Age, and we don't know much about this age. It is said that during this era, people built the portal stones, and some say they even went to the moon or into space. It is likely that this age is meant to be our current timeline and our own real world history before that age ended, which means, yes, the Wheel of Time leans much more futuristic than most people assume. The next major time frame in the Wheel of Time history is called the Age of Legends, and this was described as a time of peace and progress, led by male and female Aes Sedai who used the One Power to build a highly advanced and stable society. And to fully understand what the breaking of the world is and why it happened, we have to start here, during the tail end of the Age of Legends and the four major events that happened which led to the breaking: the release of the Dark One, the collapse, the War of Power, and Lews Therin's strike on Shale Ghul. So let's start with the release of the Dark One. About 110 years before the breaking, Aes Sedai researchers at the Kolim Dam in Visain discovered what looked like a pure, untouched source of the One Power. We see this event in the television show as the woman who would later take the name of Lanfear is seen inside a floating orb, the Sharome, and her researchers try to tap into that power. Instead, they accidentally drilled a hole into the Dark One's prison, letting its influence seep into the world and setting the stage for everything that followed. Immediately following this event, we move into the time period called the Collapse. With the entity known as the Dark One free to influence the world, everything spiraled into chaos. Fear and violence spread as people learned the Dark One was real and reachable. Many turned to the Dark One's service, becoming the first Friends of the Dark. Even Aes Sedai joined the side of the shadow, becoming what we know as the Forsaken. One of them, Agenor, began creating armies of shadow spawn, but Lews Therin and the Aes Sedai who fought for the light decided to step in and fight back. Then we move into the War of Power, also called the War of the Shadow, which was a brutal global conflict that ended the Age of Legends. And as the Dark One's influence spread, the Forsaken launched a war that would last over a century. The Forsaken used terrifying weapons and shadow spawn armies to attack cities, destroy infrastructure, and spread fear. The world's advanced technology and stability crumbled under the nonstop, devastating attacks and sabotage. The Aes Sedai, known as Lews Therin Telamon, also known as the Dragon, led the Light's forces and held back a total defeat, but just barely. To put it into context, the chaos wasn't just military assault, but economies collapsed, governments fell, and entire cultures vanished. Millions of people died. Cities were razed, and some areas became so corrupted they were uninhabitable for centuries. And as a stalemate dragged on, with each side growing more desperate, we move into the final 3 years before the actual breaking of the world. In the end, the shadow made one last terrifying push that nearly crushed the light. The Aes Sedai knew they had to act fast, and they were split over what to do next. The female Aes Sedai wanted to use the Choden Call, two of the most powerful sa'angreal ever made, to cut off and seal the focal point of the Dark One's power, a place called Shale Ghul. But the male Aes Sedai pushed for a different plan. They advocated for a direct strike to seal the bore that released the Dark One with 7 ter'angreal seals and end the war for good. And because of this split between the genders, tensions rose, and the split divided the Hall of the Servants. Then a major disaster happened. The Shadow captured the access keys for the Choden Call, the ter'angreal that the women wanted to use for their plan. And with no other choice, Lews Therin Telamon led his 100 male companions on a final assault on Sheol Ghul. And during this assault on Sheol Ghul, Lews Therin and his men did what they set out to do. The Forsaken were sealed away, the Dark One was cut off, but in that last moment, the Dark One struck back and left a parting gift, tainting the male half of the One Power, Saidin, and dooming every male channeler to succumb to madness. And this is the last major event that brings us to the breaking of the world. In short, the breaking was a chaotic, centuries long disaster caused by the madness of the male Aes Sedai after the Dark One tainted Saidin. And as all male channelers succumbed to insanity, they shattered the land, tearing down mountains, flooding cities, and wiping out nearly all civilization. The chaos lasted between 200 and 350 years. During that time, society collapsed completely, and only fragments of the old world survived. Female Aes Sedai stockpiled powerful Angreal and Sa'angreal, like we see in the television series, where we watch the ancestors of Randall Thor bring these objects of the One Power away to be hidden in Ruidion. Some men likely hoarded these tools too, making them even harder to defeat, and men that could channel were hunted down and gentled. One of the devastating consequences of the breaking of the world was the geological catastrophe itself. It wasn't just crazed male channelers killing and wiping out cities, it was much, much more devastating than that. There were rapid plate shifts happening where entire continents would move violently in just days. Mountains rose and fell overnight while oceans swallowed entire regions. Cities and ecosystems were destroyed instantly, and the world became unrecognizable. The speed at which everything changed was days, not centuries. It's the most apocalyptic event that took place within the history of the Wheel of Time. But geological catastrophe isn't the only major setback because when the world is ending, attention gets divided into multiple things. The female Aes Sedai weren't just rounding up male channelers because there were other concerns. During a book signing tour in 1994, RobertJordan was quoted saying, "The massive geological upheavals were only a part, and not the most important part, of the breaking. There was also a cumulative social collapse, breakdown of transportation systems, etc. Imagine a city like Seattle that suddenly loses all contact with the outside world. Also, the women were, after a point, trying to preserve what they could, not fight the men directly." So, RobertJordan's comment shows us that the breaking wasn't just about earthquakes and mountains rising and falling. It was also about total societal collapse. Let's put that into context a little more. If Seattle was suddenly cut off from the world, there would be no phones, no internet, no roads in or out. Supplies stop coming, and people panic. Law and order disappears. And during the breaking of the world, that's what was happening everywhere all at once for centuries. And yes, while the land itself was being torn apart by insane male Aes Sedai, with floods, volcanic eruptions, and entire regions vanishing, the deeper damage was social. Governments were gone, communication broke down. No one knew what was happening beyond their own ruined town. People were terrified and isolated. What makes this even scarier is that The female Aes Sedai weren't trying to fight back with equal destruction because they were trying to preserve what was left. That starts to divide and chisel down what would be a coordinated war effort. At this point, there is no longer a massive army to stop the madness, just isolated, desperate efforts to save books, people, and scraps of knowledge, while the world crumbled around them. The true horror of the breaking of the world wasn't just the land breaking, but the fact that everything humans had built was being erased with no way to stop it. And before we go on, quick detour. If you've ever thought about how to rebuild the world after everything falls apart, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, is worth a look. It's a big, heavy visual guide filled with real world how to's like purifying water, growing food, making metal tools, even basic medicine. And I'm not a prepper, and I'm definitely not building a bunker, but I do like beautiful books. And this one earns a spot on the shelf, and it's huge. 9 inches by 12 inches, almost 6 pounds, full of illustrations, and weirdly cozy to flip through. Maybe that's just my Wheel of Time muscle memory talking, but, anyways, if that sounds like your kind of book, there's a link in the description for 10% off. Moving forward. Now, another interesting aspect of the breaking of the world is that it's our first reference point within the story, taking place during the prologue of The Eye of the World, titled Dragonmount, which takes place roughly 4,000 years before the events in Emond's Field in Chapter 1. The prologue shows us a great personal account of the breaking. Lews Therin Telamon, once the greatest of the Aes Sedai and a hero of the War of the Shadow, is now completely insane from the Dark One's taint on Saidin. He's wandering through the ruins of his home, and he's totally unaware that in his madness, he's killed everyone he loved, including his wife, Ileana. When Ishamael appears to him, Ishamael heals Lews Therin, just so he'll understand what he's done, and that moment of clarity for Lews Therin is devastating. It's the moment the weight of the breaking hits. He's no longer Lews Therin the dragon, the savior of the world. He's also the destroyer of the world. The power he used to save the world also doomed it. And in his grief, Lews Therin travels to an empty plane and uses the one power to kill himself. In fact, he uses so much of the one power that the explosion reshapes the land. A volcano rises where he stood, and that mountain becomes Dragonmount. It's a literal and symbolic place of a broken world and a landmark that stands as a reminder to what was lost, and a place to show the reader how dangerous grief and madness is when men and women have the ability to harness such incredible power. But our best first-hand account of the breaking of the world comes from Book 4, The Shadow Rising, during Rand's seventh vision within the glass columns of Ruidion. Rand sees through the eyes of Jonai, a leader of the Dashane Aiel, as the breaking of the world begins. He is running through the city of Paradisen, the greatest city of the Age of Legends, which is now shaking with earthquakes. The streets are mostly empty, and the advanced technology of the time, jokars and show wings, have stopped functioning. He reaches the Hall of Servants, where Aes Sedai are scrambling to prepare for what's coming. This again gives us a great look at how at this point in time, the female Aes Sedai took a priority in saving relics and preparing for the future. One of them, Solinda Sedai, gives Jonai a task. He needs to lead his people away from the chaos, carrying powerful objects, Angreal, Sa-Angreal, and Terangreal, and protect them, no matter the cost. All of these relics are too dangerous to fall into the hands of the male channelers who are beginning to go mad, and there is no more time. They have to flee. Jonai wants to stay and help, and so do many of his people, But Celinda tells him their role now is survival. Meanwhile, outside the city, thousands of Aiel are waiting in horse-drawn wagons. Once a people of peace and service, now refugees trying to outrun the end of the world. We also meet Someshta, the last of the Nim, who will later become the Green Man. This vision shows us the exact moment when the female Aes Sedai realized that the world is lost and tactics shift from survival to preservation. And this is where the long fall begins, and it's the best firsthand glimpse we get of the breaking. And as the years pass, the carnage of the male channelers starts to slow down as they are caught and gentled, separating them from the one power. It's another brutal aspect of the story, because as the world slowly returns to a relatively stable place, the treatment of male channelers is barbaric and just as horrifying as the events of the breaking itself. And every culture adapts and follows a strict guideline on how to contend with men who can wield the one power. And each example is very grim. The Red Aja captures men and gentles them. The Aiel send their men into the Blight to fight the shadow until they meet their death there, a warrior's death, but it's essentially a form of suicide. The Sea Folk give their men a choice: tie a rock to yourself and jump off of a ship, or be left stranded on a deserted island with no food or water. The Amayar shield their men as they are put into a deep sleep, where the man's dreams are manipulated to let him experience his whole life before he dies in his sleep. And in every other culture, male channelers are either exiled or executed, with the exception of Shara, whose practices are no less horrifying. There, men who would be able to channel are found young and used for breeding more female channelers, but they are killed once they show signs of being able to channel. So, in a wider context, Lews Therin's strike on the Dark One has a deeply long lasting consequence. The world had to rebuild, and every man capable of harnessing the one power will live a very short life due to the constraints put in place to keep another breaking of the world event from happening again. But what would have happened had Lews Therin worked together with female channelers? What if men and women had shared the burden? The world might never have broken, or maybe both halves of the one power would have been tainted. The question sits quietly behind everything in the series. It's not just a story about magic, it's about balance and what happens when it's lost, and the breaking is just one example of that. It's why male channelers are so feared. It's not just superstition, it's history. Everyone knows the events of the breaking of the world, and that's why Rand and other male channelers are so feared. Rand holds that same power that once shattered the world, and he is prophesized to use it. And the people who stand by him, despite knowing what he is and what he is capable of, show what real courage looks like. The breaking of the world puts a lot of the story into context, even with some of the characters who seem antagonistic. Take, for example, the Red Aja, often seen as harsh, unforgiving, and man hating. Because the closer you look, the more complicated it gets. Their mission is to prevent another breaking. That fear comes from a real place, and they are trying to protect the world from another disaster. When you take a step back and look at the whole story, it's not just about prophecy or magic, it's about fear, power, and balance. The world broke because people stood alone, but it was saved because some chose to stand together. That wraps things up for now. As always, special thanks to my Patreon members and YouTube channel members. Like and subscribe for more Wheel of Time content, and I'll see you back next time.